Afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Harmony Insights lunch date. My name is Erich Kurschat. I'm the owner of Harmony Insights, LLC, a company that allows me to work with organizations and consultants using the DISC personality assessment, much of which is done online these days, both the assessment and the group workshops in conjunction with that. So anybody who wants to talk DISC, I'm your guy, and happy to nerd out with you about that, as I say. I'm also the founder of the HR Hot Seat Inclusive Mastermind community. We have over 2,600 members in 10 different licensed chapters around the country. It started out meant to be a group of 10 to 12 HR folks here in Chicago and grew well beyond that, as you can imagine. And we tackle common challenges and connect with each other, with inspiration, with valuable resources to help us do very vitally important work as human resources pros. So it's all free and all online these days, and you can find out more about HR Hot Seat by going to hrhotseat.com. Today is a Harmony Insights lunch date. I've been doing these for a while now to stay inspired by people who inspire me. And today's guest, Kaamilya Major, has made that short list, as I say. Kaamilya, welcome to today's Harmony Insights lunch date.
Thank you so much, Eric. And you know what? You inspire me as well. I have been knowing Eric for 15 years now. Can you believe it's been that long?
I can't. That's more than I thought it was.
Yeah, we actually worked together at Levy Restaurant's headquarters office. And I was actually Eric's backfill as he moved into a new leadership role at Levy in the HR department. So yeah, we've kept in touch with each other via LinkedIn, right? To check in and see what each other's been doing over the years. And, when I got the call from you, I was thrilled. I have a great amount of respect for you, not only for your broad HR knowledge, but also your training and passion for connecting people. So I was thrilled and I had to jump at the chance to have this dialogue with you.
Well, I appreciate that. I really think that some of the best work relationships are those that maybe are brief to begin with. I think you and I worked together for about 2 years, but then last well beyond where you start out. So I'm really grateful that we are still together and just thrilled that you are in the position you are today as the head of inclusion and diversity for GE Healthcare. A couple of weeks ago, I immediately following the killing of George Floyd, I decided that I needed to figure out how I was going to personally and individually contribute to the dialogue that was taking place in the United States at that point, and honestly around the world as I'm learning. And my disclaimer is I am not a D&I expert in any sense. And actually I'm struggling quite a bit to find my voice in all of this and figure out what I have to contribute and how I want to put my thoughts into words and a lot of the things that I think many of our attendees might be feeling. But it was important to me to highlight, to shed light on, feature in some way people from my network who are doing vital work in that space, who are experts, knowledgeable in some way in the diversity and inclusion space, and you're certainly among those people. People know that I choose my guests and they choose the topics for the most part. As you and I began talking and you suggested the title, Creating the Space for Conversations on Race and Inequality, what is it about that topic specifically that you felt deserved attention in our conversation today?
Yes. So in light of, recent events happening in our society, I'm calling it the social consciousness movement against systemic racism. What we've seen, especially in the death of George Floyd, has sparked outrage, has sparked, an outcry and the need and the demand for us to start having these conversations that we're not used to having at work. Before talking about racism or discrimination, it wasn't a welcome topic, just to be, quite honest. And nobody talked about it at work. And if you did, you were that person who was stirring up trouble, right? And if you talked about it, it was typically with someone in a private conversation that you thought had the same viewpoint or opinions as you on a particular topic, never out in the open. And I think, even though these tragic, situations, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, now Rashad Brooks, they are sparking, this movement within society, this outcry. It has cost a lot of attention within corporations, right? To be quite honest, I did not think that the corporate response to this was going to be as loud as what we've been seeing in society, right? And it's caused a lot of us, a lot of leaders within corporations, as well as D&I professionals, to really examine how we approach these topics and making sure that we're educating our organization on the importance of opening the floor for dialogue on what could potentially be polarizing issues, and really learning how to have that exchange of ideas. So that's why I think it's important to share that with the folks on this call. They may be experiencing the same thing, and just providing some tips on how to approach the conversation and how to create that psychologically safe environment for people to be able to express themselves.
It's great. I think it's going to be such a valuable conversation. And we have, you mentioned tips, you may share resources along the way too. So just a note right off the bat that any resources that we do talk about, I will follow up via email with all attendees today with as many links as we can include to those resources. So you're welcome to take notes. I also thought I would mention, if you click in the three dots in the bottom right-hand corner of the chat area where you would typically insert a chat, you may have the opportunity to save the chat. So as you see links being posted there, comments that people are leaving, if you didn't know that, before our conversation ends today, I would recommend trying to save that chat so that you can follow along and follow up with people afterwards. You already, I think, made mention, Kaamilya, that we have people who, or sort of we've talked about, there are people who are trying to figure this out for themselves, but there are people here that are, as I've been saying, shepherding other people through this conversation as well in their workplace. So we have HR professionals, maybe some learning or diversity and inclusion professionals, or just leaders in general who realize that they have a role to play in this conversation. I asked this question the other day of a guest. One of the things that struck me about your title, and I know you have a background in HR and recruiting, and then most recently in diversity and inclusion, is your title is the head of inclusion and diversity, which swaps the order of how I usually see it. I also see diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I also see the word belonging included on occasion. So of those different variations, what combination of words most resonates with you and why?
Excellent. So yes, I am the head of inclusion and diversity at GE Healthcare for the United States and Canada region. And I actually stepped into this title when I was at my previous medtech company. We referred to the space as diversity and inclusion. And I think before I joined GE Healthcare, there was a conscious decision to switch the words around to have inclusion first, right? So there was a shift from focusing on metrics, right? Who are we bringing in? Who are we promoting? Who's leaving the organization? And what does our diversity makeup look like? And I think that they recognize the need to change the conversation from the numbers to how we were treating and how those employees were feeling, right? So do they feel included and empowered and have the ability to, bring their best self to work? Do they feel comfortable bringing their whole self and their best self to work, right? Because we know the business case behind that, and it's driving productivity and it's driving innovation. And so with that, they changed the words around so we could have that emphasis on inclusion and belonging. And so as I've been at GE Healthcare for just a short amount of time, and if any of my colleagues are on the call and listening, I think we may have another evolution of the title to include equality and or belonging. So more to come.
I love that. A previous lunch guest recently said that she preferred diversity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And she said the belonging piece was really in that inclusion part. that
Mm-hmm.
if you're doing the inclusion part right, then the belonging kind of fits into that
Yep.
particular bucket. I think regardless of what terminology we use, companies are recognizing the value in formalizing their efforts in some way.
Mm-hmm.
We see a lot online and some fantastic statements. And
Mm-hmm.
so the question becomes, are people's companies backing up those statements? We don't have a poll today, but if your company has put out some sort of statement, a commitment to diversity and inclusion, type the word yes in the chat area. If there's some sort of formal statement that was put out on social media or on your website or via email from your company. And we're seeing that quite a lot these days. We're talking about the professionals and maybe even departments that are being held responsible for D&I efforts. Kaamilya, do you think that that is sufficient? Do you think that you're going to make the headway that you want to make as an organization simply by establishing a single management position or a department who's been tasked with diversity and inclusion efforts?
Mm-hmm. I've seen a lot of that as of late with these, company declaration statements, right? It's acknowledging what's going on, speaking up, standing against racism, discrimination, inequality. I've even had, a kind of a surprise moment of surprise in seeing how many heads of organizations, CEOs, COOs have come out and said Black Lives Matter, right? Companies weren't saying that 4 weeks ago, right?
Yeah.
And I think that, just that transparency and really putting a stake in the ground on what your organization stands for, the principles, the values, and what you won't tolerate, right? Reiterating that zero tolerance policy within organizations is certainly something that should be done. And if organizations haven't done that, I suggest that you encourage your leadership to reconsider. So with that, having a chief diversity officer, right, and saying that, hey, now you need someone to head up this effort. I will tell you, I was hired in at GE, and my position was newly created. My leadership saw the need to have someone head up these efforts for the North American region. And long before the social unrest movement, right? But now I think there is a need within my organization from the parent company, GE, to bring all of this together for all of our operating divisions across the company and appoint a chief diversity officer. And our philosophy had been to let the regions and let the businesses really develop something unique for the employee population within a specific region, country, function even. And so now I think the benefit of having someone in that chief diversity officer for a large company with over 300,000 employees like GE is really being able to share the resources. I think when you're looking at putting together an effective I&D program, you have time and you have money, resource considerations, right? And so by having that, a shared pool of resources at the top of the organization, that just benefits, all of the operating divisions, all of the regions, and being able to have, that starting ground. So I have seen a number of other organizations rush out to put their statement out there and their declaration that, hey, we're going to have somebody to, bring all this together and, create that sense of belonging and inclusion for our organization. So I think it's a good thing.
Good. I would agree with you. Do you ever fear, and this is kind of what I was driving at kind of behind the scenes, do you ever fear then that it ends there, that by establishing that, and certainly not speaking of GE specifically, but
Mhm.
in other organizations, that by establishing a manager of I&D title, for
Mhm.
example, or department, that the work stops and ends with those particular people, and
Mhm.
instead of then being pushed throughout the organization as a common value?
Mhm. You know what? It'd be a shame if it did. And I think that, this person is just there to facilitate. But in all honesty, the people who make IND and belonging and, equality come to life within an organization are the leaders. So they are the ones that have to exhibit, that behavior, that mindset, to drive inclusion throughout their teams and demand it of their of all of the leaders within their organization, from the very top, down to, some of the ground level employees within an organization, especially if you're customer facing, right?
Yeah.
Very important for those individuals to have a strong sense of, what it means to be a diverse and inclusive organization, and to have those shared values and principles. And I think also with having it, the leaders, responsible for upholding the IND philosophies. Also, it's up to the DNI leaders, right? Those folks in either chief diversity officer roles, or like my role while I'm heading IND for a region. We must hold those leaders accountable to that. So it's almost this, two-way street. We are helping to set the strategy, and the leadership is really helping to drive it down within the organization. So I think both the two must coexist.
Yes. Thank you for that. I appreciate that response. We had people just a moment ago chime in yes if their company's put out a statement. Now chime in yes if your company is backing up that statement with meaningful action of some sort. I think one of the fears out there, Kaamilya, is that it's going to end with that statement, that it's going to be something that's a little bit more superficial, this commitment, which is a great start, as we've talked about, but you want to know that companies are then doing things that maybe aren't as well advertised,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
that really are having a meaningful contribution. And I'm glad to see that there are a bunch of yeses coming through here. You and I talked before we started today, Kaamilya, about and even earlier in our conversation just now, you mentioned a handful of additional names of Black people who have been killed recently, both by police and otherwise. And if we think back, this is obviously nothing new. This has happened before. And my earliest recollections, I think, is of Rodney King, where that really was making the news, and certainly countless names since then. And you
I'll take you back. I'll take you back even a little bit farther.
do it, please.
Emmett Till, you
Oh,
know,
of course.
this has been going on, but I think, to the point that you were probably trying to make before I, chimed in with, with history going way back, was, this is, the digital age, right? We all have these, mobile phones. News is coming to us instantaneously. I can tell you, ever since, COVID started, I, downloaded the CNN app so I could, stay abreast of everything that was going on, and, in efforts to try to keep myself and my family safe, right?
Mhm.
So now it's continuing on, and I'm getting these constant, notifications of what's going on in the news. And so, George Floyd came through, and then Amy Cooper came through, and then, and it just continued on. And, the social response, the protests, all of that stuff just kept coming through the phone. But I think, my point with the digital era is now we're starting to see these events, right? It's not just, one party's word against the other. We're actually all able to see it and judge for ourselves. And, and it's nothing new. This has been going on for so long. And I often just pause and think, what's different this time, right? We saw Philando Castile in the car reach for his mobile phone, and be shot by police officers. Now George Floyd, essentially being suffocated to death, right, by the knee of a police officer. But before, we didn't receive the the response from public, that this anger, that we're seeing these days, and this call and demand for for our society to fix it, right? Finally fix it. Let's move into the right direction. And the corporate response, right? we're putting out these statements, we're appointing new, leaders for diversity and inclusion, or inclusion and diversity. But what's different this time? I like to ask that question, of people. And certainly I'd love to, hear from the group here. What do you guys think is different this time?
Wonderful. That's a great question. So if you want to include in the chat, what do you think is different about this time that we're seeing the response that we are, both among individuals and corporations? Kaamilya mentioned that part of it could certainly be social media and access that we have, that we saw. We're seeing things happen on television that maybe we didn't have the opportunity to see previously. Throw in the chat why you think this time is different. Kaamilya, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. So one of the things that a previous lunch date guest said was that the fact that we have seen one pandemic move into another pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
or a second one being acknowledged, obviously COVID-19 kind of comes out of nowhere. We are all then together, we are isolated in our homes, we are in this together, quite, literally. You're seeing that on social media and other places. And then suddenly in front of our eyes on television, we're seeing something else happens, and we are already in a place where we are united. So we're moving sort of united against one pandemic into being united against another. Do you see that being part of the reason why the response is a little bit different this time?
You know what? I'll put it out there, so COVID to, an economic crisis, right? Right
Sure.
to the social unrest. And I don't know about, everybody that's on the phone, but I've been working at home for the last 3 months now,
Yeah.
right? And so I'm not commuting, an hour plus to work. And we are just here, and we're receiving all of this information, and there's fewer distractions than there have been before, right? I mean, even I was just sharing with you about, my kids getting straight A's this last semester. That wasn't by chance. That was because I was at home and I was focused this time, right? They couldn't get away.
Yeah.
But I think that that's the same thing with the news. You can't get away from it, right?
Yeah.
And so we're at our homes, we're trying to protect our families, we're trying to, survive through what is, an economic crisis caused from COVID, right? And, we're in this survival mode. Now we're seeing something else, right? That all of us have been a part of, and apparently we can't get away from, right? So we're
Yeah.
to it a little bit differently. I think that may be one of the factors.
We have some people chiming in now, and Alberta, who you and I just realized is a common
Hey,
friend,
Alberta,
a
how are
common
you?
a common acquaintance. Alberta suggested that previously, so this has always been happening, right? This is nothing new, but previously it was words and stories that we're hearing, and now seeing more of this stuff play out in terms of images and actions, that is more powerful, or can be more powerful. And so people are taking notice in a different way. We see people saying social media, combined with a more divisive time in the country world right now. So that's sparking
Mhm.
conversation in different ways. Jocelyn chiming in that people were forced to watch the video due to the isolation and lockdown. So it wasn't just in passing if you caught it on the news, but you're sitting in front of your TV anyway.
Mhm.
So some really interesting input from our attendees, and I appreciate that. And then
Mhm.
Juanetta just says it's just hard to ignore for a number of reasons, and I think it
Mhm.
probably always has been, but ignoring it now seems nearly impossible.
Mhm.
So here's the thing. In the few minutes that we have left, I want to shift towards specific tips that you would like to share with people who want to contribute meaningfully to this conversation as individuals, regardless of any company that they may or may not work for, and individuals who are, as we've said, shepherding others through this conversation, want to have an impact in terms of inclusion and diversity efforts in their organizations. What are a couple of quick tips you can share so people can make immediate progress, and more important, I think, make a meaningful contribution to what is being discussed these days in the
Mhm.
workplace?
Absolutely. And I think, going into, the crux of why we're meeting today, creating the space for uncomfortable conversations about race discrimination. So we've already talked about, this is new for all of us, especially in a corporate environment, right? But in order to to start those conversations, I think that we all need to make sure that we're setting some conversation ground rules as we're opening the dialogue. And that is going to help us to create a contract between all participants that this is a safe space, right? This is a time where we can really come together and, just agree that we can express our experiences. We can talk about our feelings and not be judged, right? No fear of retaliation, no fear of exclusionary, consequences from speaking out, speaking up, maybe expressing an opinion that might not be shared by others in your group, right? That's one of the reasons that have kept us from talking about this in the past, right? So some of those conversation ground rules that I'd like to kind of go over is when you're entering in this conversation, whether it's on a one-on-one with your leader or an employee or in a group setting, with your team, go in assuming positive intent, right? Embrace, the mindset that this conversation is going to lead to something good. More connectivity with your team, better working relationship, right? More productivity, and then humble listening. A lot of the times when we listen just to give a response, right? So you say what you say. It's almost like, my husband and I, he says something, we're having an argument, he says something, and I just can't wait for him to get done so I can rush right in with my opinion, right? I think it's the same thing within this conversation. You really have to listen to get the lesson, right? Learn from someone else's experience. And as we're talking about these new topics in the work environment, you are going to hear some things that perhaps are new to you, or that you didn't know what was going on in someone's personal life. Even in my company, I've opened up as being an African American woman and raising African American kids. Some of the things that I have to teach them, just in everyday life. So it's not just teaching them how to drive; it's teaching them how to drive while Black, or that they can't go through a certain house in the neighborhood because there's a no trespassing sign, even though that is the shortest way to get to school. Or for my teenage son, hey, before you go in the store, take your hoodie off, right? Care if it's whatever designer, they're into the David Dobrik stuff now, hoodies. But you have to take your hood off, son, and explaining to them why, right? So you're going to learn something in these conversations that may be new to you. So just take the opportunity to learn through someone else's experience. And then being transparent. We won't always say the right thing. We don't have the answers. These are going to be potentially uncomfortable conversations. So really do, practice and expect, as you're setting the safe environment, know that you might say something that, that someone else doesn't agree with. But I think it's the open exchange and the opportunity to learn and to educate one another that's key. And then also bridging divides. I think it's time for all of us to have that courage, right? That bravery to be able to speak up against racism, discrimination, the unconscious biases, the microaggressions that we may be witnessing or have experienced at work. If we're ever going to change things, this is the time for us to be those open advocates, those allies for our colleagues, whatever the background or class may be, minority, women, sexual orientation, disability. I hope I'm not leaving out any groups here, but definitely we have to make sure, that's a good one, Marie, be an open advocate to all, and that's the key.
Wonderful. I hope people are taking notes, from creating a safe space to humble listening. People really like that term. There was so much in there that could apply to certainly well beyond this specific conversation. So thank you for sharing those specific tips, Kaamilya. I know our time, we've already gone over by a couple minutes, and I want to bring this to an end. We would normally have open conversation with attendees. I know you have a prior commitment, Kaamilya, that you need to get to. People are going to want to follow up with you, learn more about the work you're doing with GE Healthcare, among other things. Where can people find you online?
I am on LinkedIn under Kaamilya Major. That's the best way. That goes directly to my email address. So any messages, I'll get those direct. And I do welcome you guys to reach out. I'd love to continue the conversation.
Great. We will, as I mentioned, get a follow-up email out to people with links to some resources maybe that we didn't share today, just some things, Kaamilya, that you would recommend that people check out for further self-education, which is so important right now. If you enjoyed this conversation, head back to harmonyinsights.com/lunch dates. We have a couple more coming up this week. On Thursday, I'm going to be speaking with Jennifer McClure, who is the CEO of Disrupt HR, the entire Disrupt HR organization. She's so generous to spend her time with us. That'll be Thursday. On Friday, I'm doing a pop-up panel, as I call it, where I choose panelists from among volunteers on the spot to speak this time on the topic of vulnerability. So if you want to share your opinion or just show up to support your peers who end up being chosen for the panel, it's a really neat new take. I'm biased, of course, because I kind of threw it out there, but a fun new take on panel, the traditional panel discussion. And then finally, the last one on the calendar for now is next week, a friend of mine who is going to be calling in from South Africa, the Johannesburg area, talking about the Pan-African view of what's going on today, looking through the lens of apartheid and the history that she is familiar with in South Africa. So I really can't wait for that conversation. I think that's going to be such a unique take on things. I can't wait to get her perspective. In the meantime, Kaamilya, I am, as we mentioned, started out by saying, I'm so grateful that we are still in touch, that the couple of years working together 15 years ago has kept us in contact, and you showing up today to share your perspective, the experiences that you have lived, and recommendations you have for people on how to take part in this conversation going forward in a meaningful way is just so valuable to us. So thanks so much for this time. All right, everybody. Sorry, go ahead, Kaamilya. I don't want to cut you off. Okay, I think she may.
I'm back.
You were frozen for a moment there. I was just thanking you for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and call me anytime. I'd love to chat again.
I will, trust me. You're very inspiring. Okay, everybody, enjoy your afternoon. Get to it. Tackle whatever you need to tackle. Stay healthy and encouraged. And I can't wait to see you back for a future Harmony Insights lunch date. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Bye.